In this week's episode, the stories are about out athletes at the Olympics, Layla Edwards making history on Team USA, Super Bowl fans getting tactile access, and more. Hi, I'm Bernadette Smith, keynote speaker and writer. Welcome to 5 Things, where I bring good vibes to DEI. There's plenty of bad news out there. This show is about the good stuff, real progress, real stories, and ideas to help you make your work and life more inclusive. Your proof of positive change. So folks, in the last 5 Things newsletter, I wrote about how Black History Month seems quiet again this year. Second year in a row, things pretty tapered down. I'm seeing less branded Black History Month stuff like there was a few years ago, which is kind of a good thing, I guess, because that stuff was pretty cheesy to begin with. But in general, things are pretty low-key again this year. But, of course, Black folks keep making history, like Layla Edwards, who is the first Black woman on the U.S. women's Olympic hockey team, which is now headed for the gold at the current Olympics. Very exciting, and she's out there breaking ice. All right, so there's a little bonus good vibe for you. I read an article in the New York Times by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and the article gave me hope. It's called What It Means to Be a White Race Traitor, and I'll make sure that gets put in the show notes. But in the article, she traces the history from the 1800s to the 1960s, and more recently, with the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy today, she traces the history of those white folks whose activism led to their deaths. But because they were white, those deaths inspired other white folks to then take action, which ultimately led to progress. So essentially, the white folks who were martyrs for progress. So she writes about this in the article, and definitely highly recommend you checking it out. But I found it inspiring because I think it's good to be reminded that progress really requires folks who are willing to betray the status quo, the status quo of their own privilege, which reminds me that the good vibes I write about are sometimes born from the courage that it takes to be unpopular for the sake of doing what's right, so sometimes it often takes risk, the risk of being unpopular for the greater good, for doing what's right. So for me, I don't need perfection from myself or from anyone, but I do need folks who are willing to try. I know I feel a great sense of responsibility to use my influence, my privilege, for the greater good, and to do what's right. And so just wondering, what about you? Are you a race traitor? All right, let's get into this week's good vibes. The first story this week comes from the Olympics, where there are at least 47 publicly out LGBTQ athletes at these current Winter Olympics, which is a record. One of them, who's U.S. figure skater Amber Glenn, she won Olympic gold with Team USA in the team competition. But after she sort of spoke out openly about her fears and reservations, she received a lot of anti-LGBTQ backlash. And so I think the lesson here is that visibility is so important. We need that representation, but we also need protection because that visibility can increase risk. So we need more than just representation, but also some protection to go along with it. The next story comes from New York City, where there is a new commissioner of the fire department, Lillian Bonsignor, who's the first out lesbian and the second woman to lead the agency. So she actually started as an EMT back in 1991, then was a 9/11 first responder, and made her way up through the ranks. So what I think is so cool about this is, breaking barriers, as a lesbian, also as a woman, and really challenging the traditional gendered hierarchy of these types of fields. So I think it's absolutely amazing. And I think it also is a good reminder that the decades of grit and field experience that marginalized folks can bring to the table is an amazing leadership quality. So don't forget about that. The next story came from the Super Bowl, where Bad Bunny's halftime show centered Spanish language music on one of the world's biggest stages. There were also guest performances by out gay man Ricky Martin. There was choreography featuring same-sex and also mixed gender pairings. The set also included Lo que le pasó a Hawaii, bringing themes of colonial history into primetime entertainment. Again, something we don't see every day. What I think is amazing about this is that, major broadcasts, major networks often treat Latino culture and queer visibility as sort of a sideshow, but this performance flipped the script. It centered cultural identity, centered language, and inclusion was the headline. So I love it when underrepresented voices get center stage and also get creative control to make sure their moment matters. Love it. The next story also comes from the Super Bowl, where Bad Bunny's halftime performance included Puerto Rican sign language interpreter Selimar Rivera Cosme, which was the first time ever there was a Puerto Rican sign language interpreter at the Super Bowl. So she's actually worked with Bad Bunny since 2022 and works to preserve this particular kind of sign language. What I think this is so interesting because deaf communities are not monolithic, right? So ASL, American Sign Language, doesn't work for everyone. So I think that this is so important because language access is cultural access, and that includes community-specific language. So the takeaway here is if you're planning any kind of event, especially with a large audience for any particular area, make sure you budget interpreters with those relevant language experiences. All right, the last story this week comes from the Super Bowl, where some blind and low vision fans actually were able to experience the Super Bowl using a tactile device that tracks the ball, vibrates for key plays, and pairs with real-time audio. So this technology was piloted during the regular season, and then about 15 or so fans got to experience it during the Super Bowl, and then they're going to roll it out beyond that. What I think is so cool is that, sports access has long centered sighted people, of course, right? But that means that blind fans can't really participate, or they can struggle to participate. So this tactile technology allows active, independent engagement and can have really broad implications for the world, for other events, for classrooms. Super, super cool. So build that stuff in as a default, not as an add-on later, especially as the technology is here. Now let's move into this week's Good Vibe to Go. Check out the book, Nobody Told You What Blacks, Asians, and Latinos Must Know to Win at Work. Definitely something for everyone in this book, which was written by Chris Simmons, who's been a guest on this show. He's also the first Black partner elected to the U.S. Governing Board of PwC, so pretty impressive guy, great guy, and check out this really great book. And folks, if you don't already subscribe to the 5 Things newsletter, you can subscribe at 5thingsdei.com. Have a great week. Thanks for listening to 5 Things, Good Vibes, and DEI. If today's stories gave you hope or sparked an idea, share this episode with a colleague or a friend. And if you want to spread more good vibes, leave a quick rating or review. It helps others find their proof of positive change.